This is the WARZONES podcast with Tom Tugendhat and myself, James Glancy. Well, we've been discussing Iran for months now. This campaign, this conflict started back in February, and Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump promised or said that it'd be a really short affair. Now, here we are in July, and this is round 4, because back in June, just less than a month ago, there was a memorandum of understanding sort of signed between America and Iran in Pakistan to reopen the Straits of Hormuz and cease hostilities. Well, that broke down on July the 8th, with Iran striking some tankers as they went through the Straits, and there's been a retaliation and now pretty much a full escalation in both missile attacks from both sides and rhetoric. Tom, we've got ourselves into a situation, or America's got themselves into a situation here where I would put it to people that Donald Trump may be looking at having lost this campaign. And the reason I say that is that he seems to have no good options outside of a full invasion or a full withdrawal and admitting he can't meet whatever strategic aims that they hope to gain.
Well, look, James, let's just look at those two options, right? So you mentioned a full invasion. Really? How many troops do you think that is? 5 million? I don't know. I mean, it's an extraordinary option, because you're not just talking about a much larger country than either Iraq or Afghanistan. First of all, it's 92 million people. It's a much larger country geographically as well. I mean, just, to put it in context, it's sort of the size of Texas and more. I mean, it's enormous. And so, let's be honest, a full invasion is not an option. So then the question is, what else can he do? Can he take a couple of islands? Well, I guess he could, but what difference would it really make? Would it reopen? No, because the Iranians would still have the ability from strategic depth to strike targets. And one of the things that we've seen is they've got many more missiles than I think many people expected. And so that leaves option 3, really, which is withdrawal. Now, again, that's not great, and it's really not good for any of us, right? So we shouldn't be in any way celebrating any of our friends' defeats, but particularly not this one, because the reality is it gives the Iranians the control of the strait, something that we've resisted for not just 40 years, but actually 140 years, because it means that they may choose to see if they can exploit the traffic in order to support themselves and to make life harder for us. Now, that's really bad news. And at the same time, and I know we'll come on to this, there's the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandeb closing the other side. So I think that's where we are.
Well, what you can say militarily, though, is there has been a huge degradation of Iranian capability. So the statistics we've got, or given out by the Americans, is that Iranian ballistic missile launches are now down 90% from the first phase of the war back in February, and their drone launches are down 83%. So they don't have that capacity, which is to rain down hell across the GCC, which they, February was bad for everyone. And so what they're doing now is the occasional ballistic strike and the occasional drone. That said, it doesn't matter. You only have to launch a few of these things to deter tankers full of oil, full of gas going through the Straits, causing chaos on the oil markets and stopping anyone wanting to insure those tankers. No one wants to go through a narrow ocean passageway when you're being hit by missiles or drones with high explosives on, when you're sat in the bridge above a tanker full of oil or gas. So, we're in an impossible position. They have to destroy it 100%, which is not possible.
So here's the problem. It's no longer about insurance. I mean, one of the theories that the White House was exploring a while ago was that they could possibly underwrite some of the insurance, and that would see traffic continue. But it's really not about insurance. I've got a few friends who are in the shipping business, and I've spoken to some of the Med and some of the Pacific. And they're saying, look, it's not about the insurance. It's about the fact we don't want our crews to be killed, right? And, if we can go somewhere else and there's plenty of demand for shipping elsewhere, then we'll go somewhere else. We're not going to do it. So I don't know what the Americans can do, or what indeed anybody can do to encourage this. Meanwhile, as you know, the UAE are looking to build pipelines. The Saudis have already built a pipeline that goes to the other side of the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. The countries that are really in trouble are countries like Qatar, because getting their gas out is very, very difficult from where they are. Countries like Iraq are already looking. I was speaking to a friend of mine who's building a pipeline that goes all the way from those North Kurdish energy fields all the way to the Mediterranean ports in Syria. So there are options being built. There are creative ideas being come up with, but this will take time.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Anyone that is going to continue operating uh, from the Middle East is going to look at diversifying the extraction routes, and in the long term, this is going to severely undermine Iran. But right now, Iran has that ability to choke off
Right.
the Straits of Hormuz, and this is the point. This is why I asked the question: has Donald Trump lost? Has America completely lost the initiative? Because if you think back to February, the plan was regime change, or part of it was regime change. They hoped that there'd be an uprising after killing Khamenei, and yet the regime's completely cemented itself in. They've managed to regenerate leadership. Well, regenerate leadership to some extent. They've managed to continue the strikes, and 4 times they've leveraged control over the straits. It seems that the Americans didn't plan for this, and all Iran has to do, I would suggest, is hold on until a few months before the November elections, and it's going to be absolutely desperate for the Republicans during their midterm elections. So Trump has to find a way out of this, and they are not going to give up. They're not going to give up control of the straits.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think the reason I'm slightly cautious about being too sort of Tehran positive, if you see what I mean, is it's pretty clear now that Khamenei, the son of the last supreme leader, so Mustafa Khamenei, who still hasn't been seen in public, is either very severely injured or may indeed be dead. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are simply not admitting that he's died in order to avoid a sort of battle for succession. Now, whatever happens, it's clear that there's a gap there at the top of the tree. Now, how soon might that make a difference? I don't know. It depends on the internal coherence of the IRGC, which has in the past been good when it was under Mustafa Soleimani, who was, he was killed in 2020, in January 2020. But he was the sort of famous leader who led the IRGC expansion across the Middle East. Since him, though, the IRGC has had some quite serious internal divisions, not just between senior generals, but also between the older members and the younger members, because the older members are very, very rich. They've got rich frankly, by corruption. They've taken over large elements of the state and the business of the state. And the younger members, who are sort of true believers, are looking for change. I mean, let's not forget the IRGC. They're not a military unit in the traditional sense. They're much more like something like the Knights Templar or something like that. They're armed mullahs rather than soldiers, and that puts them in a very distinct category. So it is still possible that if this calms down enough so that people feel the foot is off their throat, that they might start fighting amongst themselves and other things could happen. So I wouldn't be too critical just yet, but the idea that it will happen before the November elections, I think frankly, that would be ambitious.
So the reason I went blank just there was Tom Sharp, Commander Tom Sharp, who we had on last week, and writes in the Telegraph. I was trying to watch this one. We'll read his work, his excellent work, in the Telegraph. He just messaged me because I'd asked him the question: how are the Iranians seeing the ships going through? Because there's 21 miles across the narrowest point of the straits, and I wanted to know: surely the Americans are taking out the big radars. My question was, do the ships go through with AIS on? Because if I was a ship's captain, for that bit, I'd turn my AIS off. And he said they've got a variety of methods, from line of sight. Usually you can't see that far across 21 miles is what he's saying. But whether that's infrared, thermal imaging, or their patrol boats, small patrol boats, dhows. Of course, they've got dhows that are essentially intelligence platforms giving information back. So they've still got the ability to understand what's going on, even though that their radar systems have been taken out. And what surprises me that without advance advanced ISR, they're still able to hit these ships with these small drones. So it just shows how decentralized their drone capability is to be able to control that strait. So it's not a case of just taking out their navy, as Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth boasted about, saying we've taken out their submarines, we've taken out their ships. That means they've got no ability to take control. These guys have got much more rudimentary systems in place across their coastline, which means that they can just pop up as long as they get some sort of lock on or radio communications that there's a ship in transit. They can then launch that drone, and from that point on, it gets locked on. If it's not jammed, it can lock on and hit a tanker. That's why it's so hard for the Americans to militarily take control without landing in Iran and physically pushing them back from all areas of the coast, which is almost a relative impossibility. It's a political impossibility for Donald Trump, but physically and militarily, it's just not going to happen. So that option, Tom, that is off the table. This is why I say, we asked this question, is it looking like a strategic loss? Because he's going to have to go back to this MOU, which was a 15-point plan, as I said earlier, signed in Pakistan, and it agreed nothing. And they're trying to get the Iranians to give up their nuclear materials and agree to no longer acquiring a nuclear missile. But they didn't even agree to that in that MOU. So in order to open the straits, I think something quite humiliating and very loose is going to have to be agreed because, as we say, Trump is under this political pressure with the midterms coming up. That's why I just don't see there being any positive win, success, or strategic outcome that favors America. Now let's roll this through something that's even more problematic that has emerged in the last few days. It's not a new issue, it's actually an old issue. And this is the other choke point, just the other side of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which is the Bab al-Mandeb, which is the choke point between Djibouti and Yemen. And the Houthis, who are Shias supported by Iran, who are obviously also Shia and have been supported for many, many years, they have been fighting against their arch enemies, the Saudis, and of course they hate America. Now, previously, they closed down the straits by firing on tankers going from the Suez or to and from the Suez out into the Gulf of Oman. But now, apparently, they're gearing up in coordination with Iran to close down the Bab al-Mandeb. And even worse, there's apparently been coordination between al-Shabaab, who are the Sunni militant terrorist group in Somalia, and the Houthis, which I would say, Tom, is unprecedented or something, and a development that is certainly new to have Shia terrorist groups and Sunni terrorist groups working against what their common enemy is, which is America.
Well, not quite. I mean, we saw Hamas, which is a Sunni group, working alongside Hezbollah to attack Israel. So we've seen other examples of this, again, coordinated by Iran. But you're right, this is an expansion, right? And this is, let's just look at what this is about. So we've seen, or rather we're seeing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or rather its failure to reopen. And that's having an effect on Saudi, Qatari, Kuwaiti, whatever, oil leaving there. But most importantly, actually, fertilizer. It turns out that actually a lot of the energy can be replaced by pumping in the United States. What's harder to replace, much harder to replace, is the fertilizer. About a third of the world's fertilizer came from the Persian Gulf. Not at the moment, obviously. And that's having an impact on the growing season in places like Brazil and even actually in parts of Europe. But the attempts to close the Bab al-Mandeb, what that really means is a closure of the Suez Canal, because that's the southern entrance to the Red Sea. And so what we're seeing there with the Houthi cooperation with al-Shabaab, which is this youth group in name only, that is part of the sort of Al-Qaeda, sort of wider Taliban, sort of, there's not quite the right terms, but, these sort of extremist movements that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. This is one of them. What we're seeing here is another attempt to exert pressure not just, of course, on the United States, although, yes, absolutely it is on the United States, but also on Saudi Arabia, because the pipeline that Saudi's built only takes the oil from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. And if you can't get it out, you can't get it out. So it'll be certainly problematic. Now, of course,
I mean,
the
but you say
Suez Canal.
problematic. It's a double catastrophe if you have the Straits of Hormuz closed and you've got the Bab al-Mandeb
Well,
closed.
you've still got the Suez Canal open, so you can get ships in through the Suez, fill up, and go
Yeah,
out
but then
again.
then there's then they're stuck.
Well, no, they can go north, but they can go out again back north. But it's a real problem. You're right. I mean, it is a real problem, and it adds, depending on the vessel, but something like 10 days, 2 weeks of transit time from China to Europe, because you've got to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope rather than go through the Suez Canal, because you can't go into the Bab el-Mandeb. So all of these things added together make for a real problem. And the real geopolitical problem is, what does this mean for others? Because you know, you've heard me speaking in the past about the defeat in Afghanistan and that leading to Ukraine. What is this going to mean for other places? Because the US, us, we're all being pushed around in different ways. And, you and I have been extremely critical of where we found ourselves in defense over the last 20, 30 years. And we're now seeing the US being exposed for not being able to maintain. What does that mean for insurgencies, for sort of uprisings, for challenges around the world? Because let's be frank, the Iranian war, rather like the Ukrainian war, these are the modern equivalent of sort of Vietnam and Afghanistan, in the sense that they're proxy wars similar to Cold Wars, this time being fought on behalf of the US on one side and China and Russia on the other. So we are seeing a real challenge.
Yeah. Well, my view is that the calculations going on in DC and Trump's decision making cycle is reaching a crisis point, because if this continues for the next week, the reason oil prices haven't spiked to the 150s is because there were strategic reserves around the world and global economy hasn't been growing massively. But and that's obviously slowed down to demand. But we've got to the point here that reserves have been used and the Straits of Hormuz are shut as we speak right now. If the Bab al-Mandeb gets shut, that is just going to cause not just regional chaos, global chaos. It's definitely going to spike interest rate rises. It's definitely going to spike cost of living going up across Europe, here in Britain. It's going to have political ramifications. But the point here is that it's Trump that started this war. He told us he'd have it resolved quite quickly. And actually it's developed into something even bigger, into a second strait. And that's the problem that America are facing here. A conflict that they started in Iran is now escalating from uh, the Straits of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandeb, even into Somalia. And what do they
What
do to that? What do they do if the Houthis shut it? That means they have to have the fleet deployed, hitting the Houthis, hitting Al-Shabaab. They have to deploy more special forces there out to Djibouti. It means they're starting to get bogged down in exactly the thing that Donald Trump campaigned on, which is no more forever wars, no more Middle Eastern wars. And it's going to end up with a campaign in Africa, in the Yemeni Peninsula, and in Iran.
Well, I mean, this is quite understandably very focused on the US, the way we've been talking. But I think we should bring it wider, because the reality is that there are a few things that have been exposed by this. First of all, the Chinese energy supplies reserves, sorry, forgive me, is more than 100 days. The Japanese, I think they've got 200 and something. So there are reserves of energy around the world. And quite a lot of this is demonstrating that actually it may be that the Chinese economy isn't growing as fast as we thought it was. But the truth is, the fertilizer question is a really big one. So we haven't seen the fertilizer going into places, as I say, like Brazil, where the soybeans are grown that feed the Chinese pigs, which feed the Chinese people. And so we're seeing already that impact on the lower growth. We're also seeing real squeezes in places like India and Pakistan, where the amount of fertilizer available to them at an affordable rate has been reduced. So these are having real impacts, and they could be destabilizing in ways that we haven't yet foreseen. So there's a lot to think about here, and a lot of preparation that we need to do. to make sure that we're properly equipped to support our friends and to make sure that they have the supplies they need. And at the moment, we're not really thinking about that. We're not getting on with it. I'd much rather see our new incoming foreign secretary, whoever they are, talking about where the fertiliser is going than focusing on so many of the issues that the Foreign Office seems to be obsessed with these days.
Yeah, like giving up our strategic base and
Right.
the table silence. But we're not talking about Britain, and one of the reasons is we're down to 5 frigates, 6 destroyers, of which only one ever seems to be working. We've got problems in the high north with the Russians. We simply don't have the capability that we're not a player. We don't have a navy capable of deploying, let alone with the antics being played out in Buenos Aires over the Falkland Islands. Britain has serious problems, and we are just bystanders in what happens with Trump. But my question back to you, given that you've been in Taipei for the last week,
Mm-hmm.
is the China question, because at some point they must be thinking, we could play a role. We've got more trust with some of these Middle Eastern partners. We could play a brokering role and gain some serious credibility here at the expense of America. At what point do you think we might start seeing more Chinese ships? They have a base near Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. They've got an adjacent base, the Chinese in Djibouti. So they would have a role to play talking to Al-Shabaab or hitting them. They've got a role to play talking to the Houthis. And of course, to the Iranians. Now, I know they've been behind the scenes doing this, but at some point, they might start brokering conferences or getting more physically involved, militarily involved.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of feeling in China as usual that they want to stay out of it as much as possible, which I don't blame them at all. I completely understand that. But there's a huge amount that we should be thinking about, and this is where actually working with the French in Djibouti, you're right, is important. But it's also where we should be talking to our African partners. I mean, countries like Kenya have been extremely important in various different ways over many, many years, and represent an opportunity for us to support and to sustain. Because a lot of these wars, you and I have fought them, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the whole sort of, the Lawrence line. I think he says it's better that they do it tolerably well than that we do it perfectly. Well, frankly, they're doing it tolerably well tends to be much better than us doing it what we claim is perfectly, but is in fact very often not perfect for the situation. And so making sure that we have partners who understand the importance of their own strategic interests within a region, and Kenya is a really, really good partner on that, are very, very important, because making them the leads not only lowers the cost, it obviously does that, but it improves the outcome.
It sounds great, Tom. It sounds great. But whenever you give these countries, say that you take the lead, they simply do not have the depth of experiential structures within their armed forces to deliver. They're always going to need support. I mean, you saw that when one SAS bloke on leave had to go in Nairobi and take down a building on his own. Yes, they've got some half decent counter-terrorist ability, but they're never going to be able to do it without British American support. So we could pretend these countries could take a lead, like we could pretend when we pretend in Afghanistan that they could that they were ready to take a lead. But of course, as soon as we withdraw, it collapses. So that's why it's so depressing to look at the state of Britain's armed forces, because when we have ships, we have reach, and we are able to deploy our armed forces, our elite forces, to mentor. We can actually have positive effects in these regions. Right now, we're cut down to the bone, both at sea and on land, and really unable to affect the outcomes in these areas.
Look, you're right about needing to make sure that you're providing a leadership element or providing a training element or whatever it happens to be, and it depends what you're trying to do in different places, right? But it's also true that when we try and do things on our own, and we saw this with the Americans in Mogadishu, when was it now, 30 odd years ago, it doesn't work either, and I'm afraid it's not working terribly well in the Strait of Hormuz. So the question is, how do we maintain balance, and how do we maintain endurance, and that's what we've got wrong at the moment. But look, there's a huge amount more that we're going to need to talk about, and this is something I hate to say it, but we're going to be coming back to, because there's an awful lot behind all of this, whether it's on maintaining ships at sea in these environments. And our friend Tom has already told us in the past how difficult it is because the warm water conditions, the salinity in the Persian Gulf is high, means that these ships degrade much more quickly. And then, of course, there's the whole sort of maintenance of capabilities at this kind of range. It's just really difficult. So we need to come back to it. I certainly need to do a bit of homework on it. I suspect you do too, to make sure that we're in the right place to talk about it, because this is going to be running at least for 6 months and possibly longer.
So I'm sorry, I lost you there. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
We this month need to come back around the 20th of August to the 5th anniversary of the fall of Kabul.
Mhm.
That's a major landmark thing happening. We've got Andy Burnham being installed on Monday, which means that we'll know who the Foreign Secretary and Defense Secretary is. And we've got this conflict, the round 4 going on between Iran and America. And I have to say, personally, this has annoyed me massively, just because it starts to affect one's own personal finances and situation, and that will be reflected across many people in Britain. It'll be reflected across many people in America and in Europe, and I think it's going to make Donald Trump deeply unpopular. And I don't see how he's getting out of this one without a massive climb down, which ultimately looks like a strategic loss. Just to wind up, not on the subject of Iran, Andy Burnham on Monday, who would your money be on him appointing the key positions that are going to have to deal with these Middle Eastern issues on defense and as Foreign Secretary?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The rumors going around are changing all the time. Is it going to be one of the Miliband's as Foreign Secretary, either Ed up or David from moving over from the United States? Is Shabana Mahmood going to stay as Home Secretary or move to Chancellor? I mean, personally, I think she's actually doing a pretty good job as Home Secretary. I'd leave her there. Who's going to be moving around the place? I think it's pretty tricky to answer those questions. But this is something that he's going to have to get into pretty quickly, because a lot of prime ministers, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, got involved, got into number 10 and thought they could outsource foreign policy. I'm afraid you just can't. It is absolutely fundamental to what you've got to do as a leader of a G7. You've got to turn up, apart from anything, to the many, many conferences, the Leaders' Conference in NATO or the G7 or whatever it happens to be. But you then you get dragged into things, whether it's Ukraine or Iran or whatever it happens to be. So, there's an awful lot here. And I think who he chooses is going to have a really big impact, not just on what goes on there, but what goes on here. Because as you rightly say, oil at $70 a barrel or $150 a barrel, well, that's a big difference to the cost of our commute to school or to work or to wherever, right? So all of that matters.
Yeah, you gave a really real politician's answer there, because I asked you who's going to give me your guesses, so I'll give them, and then I'll come back at
you
you.
give a guess. I don't know. I mean,
That's what I think. Miliband for one, Miliband for Foreign Secretary, one for Ambassador
to the US.
David Miliband, Ambassador to the US. And
I don't think he'll move Christian. I think Christian stays. Yeah,
that's what he's been lobbying for. And then John or John Healey. Actually, I've heard John Healey's in the frame.
So
I think Arab Khan's has been working his magic in the background and might get Defense Secretary. Have you heard anything?
No, I haven't heard.
No, I've heard nothing.
Huh?
I haven't heard anything. But this is what I'm speculating. Is it? I think Healy's in the frame, the Miliband's are in the frame, Al Khan's in the frame. I'd be surprised if other names came out for those two positions.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I don't know. I don't know on defense. I've heard nothing, so I don't know whether they're going to leave Dan Jarvis in. But I somehow am surprised.
That's a good point.
They could do, but it'll be interesting to see, because these decisions are going to affect how we live our lives. So let's get back together on Sunday next week, because I think there'll be quite a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and meantime, the Prime Minister for the last 48 hours has been collecting awards in Ukraine and in France. It's quite an extraordinary. It's been an extraordinary last few days, especially with the football, and we should probably revisit Falklands and discuss that at some point. Tom, good to speak to you. We will be back again next week. I hope the war in Iran has found some form of ceasefire, but don't hold your breath.
Excellent.
Also, please subscribe to us. I keep forgetting. Please Please subscribe to Tom on Dispatches, and please subscribe to us to Outposts. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.